Hello. This discussion examines Congress, domestic politics, and foreign policy. The textbook does an excellent job establishing the Constitution and the separation of powers. While Congress has incentives for domestic activism, we'd recognize this in terms of amendments added to bills, specific projects for districts, exemptions sometimes for districts or businesses within districts. When we think about foreign policy, whether government is unified or divided has an influence. Unified government, where Congress, both the chambers of Congress, and the President are the same party, there's greater deference to the executive for the foreign policy agenda, which makes sense because the parties are aligned. The government is aligned in ideological terms. If there's a divided government, whether it's Congress in the House or in the Senate or the President, one of those three or two of the three, usually we think of the President as being the dominant actor in foreign policy, so sometimes you have Congress where the Senate and the House is the opposite party, or one of them is the opposite party. There's going to be less deference to the executive in foreign policy when there's a divided government. A couple of characteristics, three characteristics that are significant when we think about the characteristics of Congress. First and foremost is longevity, specifically in the Senate. For Democrats, Patrick Leahy and Dianne Feinstein are the longest tenured senators currently serving, in 1975 and 1992. Chuck Grassley and Mitch McConnell, 81 and 85. So when you think of how long those folks have been in the Senate, that is an extremely long time. Now that does create benefits. They become experts in specific areas of foreign policy that they care about most. We think specifically about Dianne Feinstein's efforts in regulating and examining intelligence collection and activities post 9/11. We think about Chuck Grassley, who has served consistently in armed services and foreign policy areas as both the chairperson and the ranking member, depending on who controls the Senate. We think about polarization, party unity. Party unity here we will look at specifically for how congressional bill passing occurs, how the Senate handles whether you are party-centric or issue-specific. And we think specifically in terms of Congress is public discontent. There is a nice phenomenon, not nice, but a phenomenon we've discussed in other classes that you've probably seen, where Americans tend to like their specific congressperson, but they don't like Congress. That has differentiating effects on the government. Here we look at congressional approval and disapproval. The green line is disapproval of Congress. The black line is approval. And what you can see is that there's a significant gap between them and that they have started to diverge even more over recent times. The takeaway point here is that Congress is deeply unpopular. We don't get into why that is. We have other classes that will investigate that for you, but just know that. Congressional authority here, don't try to memorize this list. I'm not going to go through it. Read it, kind of be familiar with it. A couple of things that I do want to draw your attention to is declaring war and use of funding for military actions. So specifically the Navy here, but all the other military fall into the purview of Congress's authority. So the power of the purse and the ability, at least in the Senate, to declare war are two areas of foreign policy that we will examine. We think about collaboration and discord. Your book does talk about politics ending at the water's edge. It's just the cliche that domestic politics, we should disagree, but domestically they should get along. Now there's a good discussion of when this starts to break down. Each scholar has their own opinion. I tend to think about a split in 1968 as a pivotal year in U.S. history for a host of reasons, and then the continuation of the Vietnam War until its conclusion in the early 70s kind of splits how we think about this. I just pulled one. Each of these are videos that are worth watching. They're only a couple minutes each, but basically what we show is the Trump administration, or what I show is the Trump administration's policy on Syria. And not only do Democrats kind of understandably dissent from that based just on differences between Republicans and Democrats, but Republicans also disagreed with it. So we have to think not just that, oh, there's disagreement in Congress based on ideological bounds. Now it can be within the same party. One thing to think about when we consider these are hawks and doves. This is where the continuum and the thought process here is hawks are going to be more likely to use force, doves are not. And don't think of them as you fit into one specific area, but it's a continuum. Congressional members take different positions based on their district, based on their states, based on different concerns within it. So we think about how voting behavior occurs in Congress. And simplistically, there are 4 factors, where you are in the electoral process, especially for the Senate. One-third of the Senate comes up for re-election every 2 years. Obviously, House members come up every 2 years, and then the president's every 4. There's ideological factors, there's strategic factors, and there's situational factors that influence. The textbook does an excellent job breaking down each of those 4. The next 2 slides, or next 3, have just some basic information on federal spending that I want you to be cognizant of. Oftentimes, I use how frequently Americans don't know how much we spend on foreign policy to articulate that we frequently, as residents or people living in the United States, don't know what Congress spends money on and how that ends up working. So here I just point the percentages. You have the Defense Department, all other spending, Health and Human Services, Social Security, the big buckets of the federal budget. This one is from the same 2018 Treasury report. I just wanted you to see most taxes comes from individual tax and tax withholdings. Corporate tax is only about 6% of the federal budget, and then other revenues is about 11%. Here's the deficit and operating costs of the government. When in 2020 is going to explode this. Now that isn't necessarily good, bad, or otherwise. We're not going to get into kind of the politics of the deficit. I simply want you to be aware of it's there, and if you go and you find that Treasury report, they break it down just the same way you would kind of break down a regular budget for a household. It's very fascinating. All right, here's senatorial standing committees. All of them are important, and they all actually impact foreign policy more so than we would think, including things like agriculture. Maybe the judiciary is probably the one that has the least effect on foreign policy because, as we mentioned in previous lectures, that there are less, the judiciary, especially the Supreme Court, tends to try to stay out of Congress and presidential debates on power. Okay, so here's the one, and I apologize for the video being over it. As I mentioned before, slides are going to be available, but one of the tutorials that I read about online teaching said that you should move where the camera is, so I'm trying. Okay, one is committee-centered and one is party-centered. Okay, Congress is organized to promote gains from exchanges from legislators with diverse interests based on how to get legislation passed. This is committee-centric theory for party assignments. This would say log rolling occurs. You vote for what I want, I'll vote for what you want. If you've seen Charlie Wilson's War, it's a movie with Tom Hanks. Historically, it has, just like most Hollywood movies, there's a lot of inaccuracies, but it's a fascinating story how one kind of no-name Congress House of Representatives member from Texas basically starts funding efforts to counter Soviet incursion in Afghanistan, basically through log rolling. There's a fantastic scene in that movie where Tom Hanks' character says, well, I represent a district that really only care about making sure their guns are protected and religious liberty. And so I'll vote for anything as long as it doesn't involve those 2 issues, because I got to stay on those, and I'll help you out. Okay, so that is based on kind of committee assignments. The other is that there's party-centered, and this is that the majority party structures committees to most benefit them. Mitch McConnell is an expert at utilizing this party-centric approach to governments. I'm not saying whether that's good or bad, and the way you can recognize that is that when McConnell allows for votes to occur in the Senate, very rarely do votes split Republicans? So what he has done is try to protect kind of party integrity, so to speak, by curtailing what gets voted on. Now, clearly there's some long-term negative consequences for governance with that approach. On the flip side, when national votes come on, the Republican Party in the Senate hasn't had numerous votes where you'd be splitting your base or when you may undercut your overall message. Okay, I'm not saying that's good or bad, just saying that's a tactic. How does Congress exert power? Typically over the power of the purse, can be specific legislative oversight, public hearings. These especially, we think about the Church Committee in the 1970s, that when Congress gets motivated, hearings can be effective, and they can also potentially shift public opinion. Okay, so we think about the use of force. There'll be 2 other lectures on the use of force in Congress, both Howell and Peavey House, as well as audience costs. But just recognize this: Congress has the ability to dismantle president's military ventures. They can convey military resolve, either voting for military action or the continuance of it, something like the Iraq War continuation votes, or they can vote against it, and that sends a different signal. The War Powers Act covers something that we do need to spend a couple minutes on, which is how frequently does the United States declare war? How often has it actually, does Congress exercise its constitutional duty to declare war? Versus how often the U.S. uses military force. If you think about how many wars we've been in, right? The Iraq War 1 and Iraq War 2 were not wars, technically. Right? They did not have declarations of war. Well, maybe Iraq 1 did. Iraq 2 certainly did not. So we can Wikipedia check that. It's early when I'm recording this. So what happens with the War Powers Act? Well, the War Powers Act curtails the power of the president by reasserting the power of the Senate, specifically. This passed over Nixon's veto in 1973. I want you to think about that, what it would take today for Republicans and Democrats in the Senate to agree on something to overcome a presidential veto. Whew. Okay. Every president since Nixon has said that this legislation is unconstitutional, but none of them have challenged it enough in court for it to go up to the Supreme Court in any full review. There have been aspects of it that have. What the War Powers Act says is that Congress must be consulted before deploying troops into armed combat. Presidents do have a 48-hour window here. So, for example, President Obama, I don't think, consulted Congress on the Osama bin Laden raid until it was over. And I mean, it wasn't necessarily, it was not a highly planned, highly dangerous, highly successful raid that Congress may have been like, wait, you're going to go into a sovereign nation next into a high probability event where, you know, gunfire is happening, this is going to be violent. Pakistan, we have a complex history with Pakistan, maybe you should wait. Well, he made, obviously, I think, in my opinion, the right choice without notifying Congress. Right? So this isn't about leaks, this isn't about deep state, this isn't none of that nonsense. This is simply the window of opportunity presented itself, it's time to execute the order. Now, Congress, however, if you're in theater for more than 60 days, Congress has the power to vote to remove funding for the troops. Right? How frequently is Congress going to vote, so to speak, against the troops, which is really what you'd be doing? That is even in today's environment, voting against a military action is one thing. Voting against troops on the ground is another in terms of funding. Right, and that creates ethical dilemmas for politicians that we could get into later. Between 1975 and 2015, presidents have complied with this resolution. This is from the Hooks textbook. This isn't my own. By submitting World Power Resolution, it's a resolution, acts on 160 different military actions. Right, it's not until 2015 that presidents stopped doing this. Okay, so the War Powers Act, you think, how effective has it been? There's a debate there to say. Major pieces, the War Powers Act is the major one I want you to think about here. If you look at the terms, I actually don't have any of the key legislative terms for the chapters, and part of that is just a function of how much material we cover in the summer. So, to recap, power of the purse, Congress affects foreign policy, and I do want you to be kind of aware of the constitutional separation of powers and how they have been both blended, reasserted, and where they've been ineffective. So think through that question as you move forward in this section. Thank you.